Okay, so yes, this is being recorded as always and will be posted online.
Thank you. So first thing is next call. That would be September 24th, same time, same channel. Any concerns with that at all? All right, 2 weeks from now. So we have a couple different things today. We're going to start out with a presentation by Nicholas around largest contentful paint. And then we can get into a couple issues around preload and performance timeline. And certainly if there's anything else after that, we can try that as well. Nicholas, do you want to start off with largest contentful paint and a callback about to indicate the observer is about to stop? I'll post the issue and I believe your slides in the chat as well.
Sure. Yeah, so in the issue, there's someone asked for a way to know when the LCP has been finalized. So basically that happens when user input occurs. And currently, currently there's no easy way to determine this because user input can be a tap or it can be a scroll, or it can be a keyboard key down. So it would be pretty complicated to try to figure out when that occurs in order to determine when the LCP algorithm has stopped. And then I suppose there's also the problem of when the page goes hidden. It could be considered as a way to consider the LCP algorithm to have stopped because any rendering after it goes to the background will be affected by however long the user was in the background. So any timestamps after that are not useful for the purposes of LCP, right? So that is something to consider as well. So I wanted to present an idea that we've been thinking about, which is to have a final LCP. So now first let me go over the problems. One problem we have is that right now it's possible that the latest candidate, or yeah, shall we say the largest candidate, the one that's the actual LCP, has a smaller start time. This can happen. For instance, consider an image that has no timing allow origin, and then a text that is a little smaller, but the render time of text is always precise. So wait, is this a good example? Oh yes, and then so the image will have a start time that is the load time of the image because it has no timing allow origin. But entries are processed in get entries in order of the start time, as we all know, right? They are by default returned in order of start time. So a developer would need to check that the image is actually larger to detect that it's the correct LCP candidate. However, even that is not infallible because what if the image was removed and then the text became the actual LCP candidate? So it's basically impossible to know which is the real LCP as of the current API, right? Due to the timing allow origin issues, as well as the fact that we consider removed elements to no longer be valid LCP candidates, which, by the way, I'm looking into that particular problem as well, but let's leave that for another time. Now, another problem is that you could have a large image that is loading by the time that the user starts interacting with the page, or even the time when the user unloads the page. And in that case, you should consider LCP to basically be not reached. in the sense that there was an LCP candidate, which was the image, but it didn't finish loading. So there's no valid LCP timestamp. However, the current API and any user of that API will just assume that the last LCP candidate that was provided will be the actual final LCP in that case, which to me is incorrect, and it will hide some performance problems from some sites, in particular if they have a super giant large image that basically never finishes loading by the time the users leave the page, then it will not surface that problem to the users. And finally, the last problem is that, like I mentioned from the issue, there's no reliable way to know when LCP has stopped. You would need to have a bunch of event handlers, and presumably you might want to, well, users probably already look at the page visibility change, so that maybe that's not a huge deal, but at least for stopping due to user input, it's pretty hard to do right now. And I don't think we would want to recommend users to add event listeners for everything that's required. So the alternative is to just listen for the LCP forever until the page becomes hidden, and then just dispatch the largest one then. But like I said, this largest or / latest is not guaranteed to be the actual LCP. So those are the problems with the current LCP API that we're trying to tackle here. And the proposed solution is to have a entry which just surfaces this last LCP. Again, in case people forgot, the stopping conditions are when user input occurs or when the page becomes hidden. So actually right now for the API, I guess it's when the page becomes unloaded or closed. So that's slightly different. But in any case, surfacing that would solve all of these problems, because now there's no ambiguity on when you did not actually have a final candidate and when the final candidate is one with a smaller start time than some of the other candidates that were surfaced in the API. For the details of the implementation, we could have the same kind of entry, just with a different entry type so that you can observe it separately. Presumably, most users would just want this final one, since I imagine few people actually care about the whole process of the LCP candidates, whereas most people just want to know what is the actual LCP value for their site. So the entry type could either be largest contentful paint, replacing the current entry type. It would be a breaking change, but it's something worth considering. Or it could be a new entry type, something like final largest contentful paint or something super long like that. But basically, it should be distinct from the entry type of the LCP candidates. So this kind of entry would be similar to something like FCP, which naturally just surfaces one entry per document, right? This would be at most one, as opposed to the current API, which surfaces potentially several LCP candidates throughout the course of the page. And for that reason, it could be exposed in the performance timeline, because that's what we usually do. We allow exposing these one-off entries in the performance timeline, since it's an easy way to determine if they have been reached or dispatched at any given point in time, instead of using a performance observer and take records on the observer. One tiny, well, actually not tiny, I don't know how big, one technical constraint or concern that I have is that it would need to be available on the visibility change event, especially if it's the one right before closing the page, so that the user can confidently query the entry and dispatch it to analytics or whatever on that visibility change event before the page gets destroyed, right? So this is a constraint because basically LCP stops at that point in time. So it needs basically to compute the value quickly and before the event gets dispatched to the page, which is a concern I have worth mentioning. So, and that's it. That's my presentation. I don't know if people have thoughts, comments, complaints, or whatever.
Nicholas, so if my understanding is correct, the only time that we would be able to emit this final largest contentful paint would be on user input or page hidden, so basically unload. That means the data would not, that particular mark would not likely be available at onload, like at the load timestamp or whatever mid-page timestamp analytics are sending their beacons.
Right. So I guess that's one question, right? Whether we should consider the stopping of this algorithm to be when the page becomes hidden or when the page becomes unloaded. Because as I mentioned, for the purpose of analytics tracking, the first hidden is really the true place where you would stop looking at LCP, right? Yeah. So even though things like paint timing, we expose the entry, even if it occurs after the page has become hidden, in this case, due to the complexity, it may make sense to just consider the algorithm for the final candidate to be terminated upon the first hidden, if that makes sense.
Nick, did you say on load or on unload?
So for Boomerang, which we are capturing our largest contentful paint through this API today, we generally send all of the data that we have at the onload event, or the page load event. I guess I'll just call it the page load event. Because we've, as we've talked about in previous calls, the unload event is rather unreliable across browser to send data out. So if we continue capturing largest contentful paint in the way that we do today, which is by sending a single beacon at the page load event, we would probably never see this final largest contentful paint event, because we're not waiting until the end of the page, or we're not waiting until the user navigates away or closes the browser or whatever to send the data.
That's surprising to me though, because like, what if the website has a unload handler that loads the whole page after? Then you're gathering no data?
Well, yeah. So, and for Boomerang specifically, for sites that have single page apps, we have our own single page app handling that may not wait until just the page's load event, may wait until all the networking activity quiets down, and then we send our beacon. But basically that event, the point that the page has finished its network activity and finished its loading activity, is when we just take the largest contentful paint, whatever it was latest, and send it out at that point. So we're basically the largest contentful paint up till the page has stopped loading from a algorithmic point of view. So yeah, so it's in traditional apps, it's just the onload event. In single page apps, it's maybe a little bit later, but we're not waiting until the end of the hidden state, if you will, to send our data.
That's good to know. So I guess this proposal, if you don't change where you send the data, it would not work for you, probably.
Not in the way that Boomerang sends data today, and I guess my guess would be that looking at other analytics packages, most of them probably follow very similar behavior, which is not waiting until the very, very end of the hidden event to send their data. Most analytics packages send data earlier. You can do some stitching in the back end to stitch together data from the page load event along with some unload data at the end if your infrastructure can handle it. Boomerang doesn't do that today, and maybe other analytics packages don't necessarily do that either by default. And a lot of that is just the unreliability of the unload event and getting the data out.
I see. And have you found the page height event to also be unreliable, or why is that one not used? Sorry, not page height, the visibility change, because I know there's confusing names for that.
Right.
Yeah.
There's also the balance of trying to get real-time data as well for us. So somebody could theoretically load a long article, leave it open in the background while they're reading it, leave it open for another 5 days while it's on on their browser tab, come back from the weekend, and then navigate away at that point. That data is no longer real time if we were to wait until the hidden event. So we try to send some data at least at the page's load. We actually do send unload data, but for reference, we do send a beacon at unload, and this is for specifically tracking how long the person was viewing that particular page. We've found in general we get about 60 to 70 to 80%. I haven't looked lately, but between that, let's say 70% of pages generate both a page load beacon and a unload beacon. So about 30% of the time we're not getting unload data.
That's pretty bad.
Yeah. Yeah. Yep.
Okay. So what I hear is that it's likely analytics providers would not be able to use the API, so they would probably keep using the candidates, which may be less reliable but more easier to use because of the way they are dispatched continuously over time as the data is gathered instead of at the very end.
Right.
Okay. Does anyone else have thoughts on whether it would be useful at all or not?
I had a question for Nick. Do you track the first visibility change event as well as do you know what the reliability of that event is from your data?
Oh, sorry. You're saying do we send like a beacon at that point, or?
Mm-hmm.
We do not send a beacon at that point, but we log in if it happened to be before the page load event or before we send our first beacon. We log the timestamp of the latest hidden, the latest visible, so we know if that has changed at all during the page load.
Okay.
But we're not sending a beacon at the visibility change event.
Okay. I was just thinking if sending a beacon at load like you do today, and then also at first visibility change would be more reliable than waiting until unload and get most of what you want. And then not be additional like QPS or whatever on your backend.
Yeah. Sorry, we and I'll have to double check our code. We actually do attempt to send, I believe, our unload data at the first page height event. Is that what you're talking about?
Do you mean page height or visibility change?
Yeah, let me double check that.
Like I said, the names are confusing and they are actually quite different. So, yeah.
Yeah, I'll have to double check on that.
Yeah, I'm just asking mainly because I'm curious to get some real world reliability data of the first visibility change event. We have been recommending that to developers as a more reliable alternative to unload and page height.
We currently use page height. We're not sending data at visibility change.
And Nick, as another follow-on, I understand that the infrastructure is hard to sort of stitch together the two different things, but what about all post-load analytics? Like as we increasingly add more, like I wonder, what do you do for layout shift today?
We measure layout shift up until the same load timestamp, whether it's traditional load or SPA load. Yep. And yeah, and certainly more sophisticated backends can do that kind of stitching a little bit better, but then there's always a trade-off versus kind of real-time analytics, if you will.
To this naming issue, final LCP is clearly not the best. This just makes me wonder again whether we should be doing a first contentful paint and a last contentful paint and doing it as a range. I think that might solve a lot of the problems you are seeing here. And that is something that API shape, I think, would be better.
I mean, I'm not sure what you mean by last, though. And as Nick was saying, they can't really wait for the last. And I think having last contentful paint candidates would be even more confusing than largest candidates. Anyway, so I don't think last. I don't really like last as the alternative. I mean,
Okay,
it could be
final contentful paint then.
Yeah, sure. That makes sense. Oh, but you mean just change last for this one, like say last contentful paint instead of final largest? Is that what you mean?
I would love to move this working group more towards the idea of a range instead of this is a metric we care about for these 6 months. Like, I think in terms of longevity of this API, in terms of service to web developers, I think we'd be much better to mess about with whatever LCP is and then bracket it with things that are known. Like, first contentful paint is useful. Like, I think trying to expose the whole range of paints is more useful than pinning it on metric du jour. And I feel like the API you've just described is it's adding further and further complexity for no real win here.
So I heard from folks that are gathering like a large platform that they are trying to measure like with the current largest contentful paint API and have real trouble understanding when the last one has fired, so that they want to beacon things at that point in time. Instead of relying on unload, they want to rely on the point in time in which, the actual largest contentful paint candidate has fired. And so this is the problem they are trying to solve. I don't know if this is because I'm also not a big fan of final here. At the same time, I don't know if this is necessarily the last paint, because there could be paints after that that are potentially smaller or that follow some user interaction. So I don't. Maybe it's worthwhile to, open an issue in Bike Shed. I don't have any great ideas at the moment, but yeah, I take your point that the name can be improved.
But more to the point, like if we had an API that had a final contentful paint, then we know that the LCP is actually valid, right?
I'm not sure I understand what you mean by that.
Like right now, we have an LCP that might not be valid because all the events might not have been processed, right?
Yep.
And there's no way to mark that in the current LCP proposal, right?
Right, because because you don't know when it's the final.
Right, exactly.
When you dispatch the entry.
Yeah, so we could kill two birds with one stone. We could give developers a range of paint timings to let them know the first and the last, and they know that, oh, if we have a last, then the LCP is valid. That seems like a lot easier to explain than this. But maybe that's just me. And I'm certainly willing to hear other opinions and other ideas.
Yeah, I kind of understand that since we have first, you're thinking about last. But I just think that this one is not necessarily the last again. So that's what I'm worried about. Like just
because last here, I mean, are we still just talking about the definition of last being like when a user input happens or when the page becomes hidden? Like there's no other way to know last. I mean, like for a single page app, there could always be more paints happening, right? I guess I would be confused about how that's any different than the current proposal.
Would it make more sense to split out PWAs from this discussion?
Did you mean single page apps?
Yes, sorry, yeah.
Okay.
yeah. So even like for a normal page app or whatever you want to call it, I feel like the last can be confusing because even if it's last before hidden or before user input, the one I'm proposing is not that. It's the largest before that. So I do take the point that the naming final is not good. And I agree with that, but I also don't think that latest or last, I'm not sure if that's solving the issue. In any case, I think we need to figure out if there's actually people that would be truly interested in the API, because it sounds like no one here was. And then we will go from there.
Yeah, I think, I mean, you know, the voice of one analytics provider here is certainly not a wide survey of the industry and how people are collecting these things too.
Totally.
So certainly would love to see, you know, I mean, there could be other scripts or tools that would, you know, like to key off of this because it'd be easier. Just from a developer ergonomics perspective, I like having a single event that, you know, somebody could use rather than what we have to do today, which is keep on listening, keep on waiting, keep on checking things. So I do definitely see the value in it, and maybe some other analytics scripts would prefer to key off it this way. So
yeah, but if there was like if you could replace what you're using the load event for today with that event, that okay, we're done with paints because something happened. Would that be a better way for you to, like, would you consider moving from the load event to that kind of an event?
But again, that kind of event could be minutes, hours, or days later, depending on if there's no user input or unload, right?
Oh, you're saying the user went away, didn't touch loaded the page and then left the computer.
Left it open, came back after lunch. It's, you know, an hour and a half later.
Sure.
So
yeah, but I guess like combining that with a timeout or something along those lines, would that
potentially? Yeah, I guess combining that with the timeout would be a little more safe for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I'd be interested in doing that from our perspective. I mean, we've always used just after unload and stuff, just because that's the only thing that's been reliable. Right? Certainly, if we had a reliable mark that we knew would happen, and I'd already put in a timeout after unload in case we didn't get anything, then I'd be interested in getting that data.
Yeah, I also agree with that. And certainly, it sounds more reasonable than just adding one more listener over like an event that you can just observe on. So yeah, it totally makes sense to me. Even if it's not the final largest contentful paint, like if we can find a different name.
So I guess to move forward on this issue, Nicholas, did you want to work on, or I guess we probably solicit a little more feedback first would be one thing from other analytics providers. I could probably reach out to a couple of people that I know, and I don't know if what other contacts you have, but just to kind of get more eyeballs on the proposal would probably be a good idea.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay.
And then we shall think more about the naming. Naming is hard.
Yeah. Well, and certainly, the proposal may change. Like naming should be the last thing chosen, depending on what it actually does.
Yeah, assuming the proposal does go through,
Yeah.
then we can think about the naming. For now,
But-
it's not clear if we're gonna move forward with it. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for taking the time to go over that with all of us and being patient with us while we tried to figure it out too. Any other thoughts on that before we move on? Okay. So let's see. So there was a couple issues in the preload spec that we wanted to talk about. There's one or two pretty quick ones. First is, I don't know if we still actually need to talk about this at all. So issue 147 in the preload spec, just sent the link over for that. This is about basically moving some of the spec language in the preload spec that we actually may want to move to HTML spec and not in preload itself. I don't know that there's going to be much controversy for this at all. Any thoughts or concerns about it? It's just probably work that we need to.
I mean, there's a PR open for it, but it's been open since July.
Yeah.
I see. PR?
I missed that part. Okay.
Which PR?
PR 152.
It's just linked in the issue, right?
Oh. Right.
Okay. So I guess there has been some back and forth, and you've actually taken a look at that as well. I guess there's nothing we really need to discuss as far as that one. We can probably just leave that to the PR itself.
Yeah, I think that it's already, like as Dom said on the issue, the relevant text is already in HTML and it just needs to be removed from preload. But in any case, we want to move the whole thing over, so I don't think there is much to discuss here. And the same more or less goes to the next one, I think, the 153.
Yeah. Issue 153 is discussing removing the dependency section. Now that respec supports automatic cross-linking, that probably just requires somebody's time at some point. This could be a good candidate maybe for the hackathon. I don't know. Yov?
So if we're trying to use the spec processing model into the HTML standard anyways, is it worth kind of doing these Band-Aid fixes to this spec and then ultimately just moving it anyways, or what do we think about that?
I think we don't really need to do that. We need to see with Philippe, like when the actual move to HTML will happen, and maybe we can preempt it by making sure that everything is covered in HTML. So we could start PRs to move the relevant parts that are still defined here into HTML. But I don't think that we need to bother with respec related chores when this whole spec will probably move to be a note anyway.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Yeah.
Okay. There is one other issue under preload, number 149. And I'd be happy to take over scribing if you want to talk about it a bit more.
Sure. Basically, the underlying issue here is that people want now to add various hints to servers in order for them to modified the way that H2 push is done in various ways that servers don't currently expose to their users for various reasons. So to me, there are two underlying issues hidden in this. One, whether it makes sense and whether defining that kind of a hint that is content-based will cause servers to actually do what they currently don't do. And I'm not convinced by that. But beyond that, the more the underlying issue here is that we somehow sneaked various push-related behaviors into preload. And I personally think we shouldn't have. And it doesn't really make sense to define all those server push-related behaviors as part of a preload spec. And in particular, because we're moving this into HTML, this makes it even more tricky to define those various push-related behaviors as part of the link relationship, only to be used by servers as part of headers. There's a weird dependency here, and I would much rather see a completely separate relations set up for push and being worked on as part of server push. I don't know if it's something that should happen at the ITF or here, but I'd love to see this separated from preload. And related, Andrew's colleague, Lucas, pinged me the other day about no push, which apparently is not really defined anywhere, but exists in various examples here as part of the preload spec as an attribute that servers can add on preload headers in order to prevent server push from happening. And I think it would make sense to split all that functionality apart because it's not really preload related. Does that make sense to everyone? Any objections, Andrew, in particular, for the push angle?
I agree. That's all I'm saying. Yep.
Okay, and from your perspective, if there could be some compatibility concerns with that, because that would mean you would need to tell your customers to change headers if you want to continue to push resources if you were to follow that advice.
Agreed, but it's still better to have it separate from preload, right?
Okay.
Basically, that's what we ended up doing, just reusing that, which wasn't great. That's where we've ended up. Yeah.
Okay, cool. That's great to hear. Okay. Anyone else with strong opinions on this? Okay, so I can take an action item to comment that on the issue and maybe open a separate issue saying that that push related hints should be split apart. Okay.
Sounds great.
Yep.
Okay, so I think that's the end of the preload specific issues. We have one performance timeline issue. Issue number, let's see, 105. And this is about performance entries that are affected by background statuses. We've talked about this a couple of different calls. Nicholas, if I remember correctly, you wanted to chat about this a little bit more.
Yeah. But it looks like no one from Apple is here.
It's true.
So that's a bit of a problem, but I mean, I can go over what I chatted with Yoav offline. Was that there is some confusion maybe about the use cases. There are various use cases here. Some of them are related to throttling, but some of them are related to actual visibility. So I think we need to be careful to try to support both of them. Because for example, paint metrics really need to consider the visibility state of the page regardless of throttling, because right. But then other kinds of performance measurements that are not paint related may may want to consider throttling of other kinds. So we were thinking there can be roughly three kinds of statuses here. One is the visibility status of the page. So it's either hidden or it is visible. And then the next thing to consider is the network status of the page. So it could be either fully going or it can be throttled by the user agent. And finally, the CPU usage of the page can similarly be throttled or not throttled. So we were thinking exposing these three signals might be, I mean, we already exposed visibility, but exposing the other two might also make sense. And we were wondering about, first, do people here have like some concrete use cases for that besides the obvious ones, which are track possible taintedness of paint metrics as well as other performance metrics for the case of throttling. And the other thing we wanted to ask is if people have thoughts on API shape / naming, because I was working on something called the visibility state entry. And obviously, something called visibility state entry would not be extensible to network and CPU throttling. But at the same time, it's a little different, right? Because for visibility, it's hidden or visible, whereas the other ones is basically throttled or not throttled. So I'm wondering what people think about whether it makes sense to have an API that covers all of those three types of states, or whether it's better to have them separate. And if together, then who can come up with a good name, etc. So I wonder what people think.
A lot of good thoughts there. I like the idea of getting more visibility. Bad use of word there, but into the network and CPU. And it certainly, the use case that you pointed out for analytics would be, marking whether data is tainted or not, essentially in different ways. As far as like the interface goes, it might make sense to have it all under one API that would have these different attributes. It would seem to be a little more extensible if we have some other future thing that we wanted to let people know about, I don't know, the GPU or something like that, right, in the future. But, no strong opinions, I guess. But the idea in general sounds really nice.
Anyone else have any thoughts? The other thing I was thinking right now is we've always, or historically, the group has pushed back on exposing throttling signals because it's basically impossible to define. But I guess since it seems that throttling has become pretty common in some cases for user agents, like as Safari was saying, they sometimes even throttle the a visible page, right? So even if we're not able to define the granularity of throttling, as long as a user agent is like in knowledge that it's throttling to some degree, then I think it makes sense to expose it, and it covers the use case of figuring out a volume of tainted entries and how the taintedness of the entries affects the measurements, because you can like compare values when it says it's not tainted versus when it's saying that some taintedness happened. And so maybe it's okay to not say what user agent throttling means, even if we're exposing it. I don't know.
And kind of related, but I don't know if this would be one of the signals, would be this, if developer tools are open at all. I mean, that can certainly taint results and measurements in some way too. But
yeah, that's a good point. So it sounds like there are several different types of statuses that could potentially be added. Like DevTools open sounds like. It could affect. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. I mean, DevTools open would impact the, like, in a way, CPU throttling, but not beyond that unless the network throttling tab is also checked, right? I mean, it's not a different dimension of throttling. It's a different reason to reach those dimensions. At least that's the way.
So, Nick, were you thinking DevTools open just? Yeah.
I mean, DevTools can do many things, and if people on DevTools are doing things, maybe pausing, maybe stepping through, I don't know. I'm just thinking out loud that like a DevTool experience is not a normal experience, and so if you're measuring in bulk, I'd like to segregate those experiences in some way, just to make sure, we're not trying to investigate a bunch of people with DevTools open. I don't. Just thinking out loud. I don't want to derail this conversation about that specifically, but besides the three that I definitely agree that you mentioned, Nicholas, there could be other kind of side signals too that may be helpful for some people.
Okay, so you're saying like basically code, like breakpointing is another dimension.
And
that sounds very DevTools specific.
Yeah, exactly.
Script was injected by DevTools in this page.
Yeah.
So I actually want to push back maybe a little bit. I'm a little bit more skeptical on the utility of this additional information. I definitely have wanted this in the past, so initially I feel supportive towards it. In fact, we do actually use visibility state at Wikimedia as well to basically right now we're quite aggressive on them. If visibility has been toggled at any point before unload, we just discard the entire event and pretend the page view didn't happen. As far as performance analysis is concerned, I think in the future we might want to collect it still and judge it separately. I think it's still interesting to have maybe, but I think over time I've become more ignorant of it, just because I think it's just part of a larger range of real world circumstances, which I think to me is kind of what RUM is for, is to really get a sense of the bulk, like how do your users specifically load this page, and when throttling happens in the foreground, why should that data be segregated? Like that is still a real user experience. And if lots of users are in that way, maybe it's interesting to know from a product perspective, but that hits on privacy things as well, and how you can synchronize things between tabs, and what is the accuracy if the throttling goes on and off, does the data goes on and off as well, and things like that. Like I think I would want to know more about sort of the high level use cases, like what do we think as engineers how would it influence our choices maybe from performance perspective? Would we ignore the data more, or would a typical developer end up turning those things off and just not see it? And how would that affect user experiences, or would it have a positive impact somehow? Also thinking about throttling as a range of things, right? Like you can imagine a degraded network being a form of throttling, or some form of degraded experience, or having not so much disk space available, or being in swap, or having not much memory left. Like to what extent is that just so for example, the reason I was very much into this earlier is because I wanted to have more consistent ROM data, to have a small slice of data where I can say, here's my sample group of non-throttled devices in Sweden using an iPhone. But basically what you're doing there is you're trying to get a stable baseline, which is useful, but that's also kind of what lab testing is for in a way. And that has been improved so much over the past few years that, at least to me, it has mostly removed the desire to be able to do that for ROM data.
Yeah, I think from our point of view too, it's not to, I don't want to mark this data to throw it out or to ignore it. I want to be able to mark data that, just like other dimensions like your geo and other thing, like if our customers wanted to segment their data or to investigate the performance differences between a fully visible page versus a partially a page that went from visible to invisible or back and forth, that they'd be able to do that. So I think having insight, if you want it, is more of the goal here from my perspective.
Timo, I just wanted to say I loved everything you said. I agreed completely. I have thought about this as well, about this baseline, because I thought that it would be very interesting to know what can be attributed to your changes affecting, performance over time versus the world just changing. So like you said, network throttling, but also big browser changes, more preloading, more BF caching, more all this other stuff. And so have you improved or regressed, or is it just browsers like patching over things and stuff like that? And so a stable baseline feels like it's interesting, but also representing real ROM data as things do change is probably, you're right, like as lab data becomes more reliable, maybe you don't need that stable baseline, you have it already there. So yeah.
Hi.
At Pinterest,
Go ahead, Michelle.
At Pinterest, we have synthetic tests. We use Puppeteer, and we also collect ROM data. And we're definitely not anywhere close to getting a baseline that's usable with our Puppeteer tests. There's tons of regressions that we still have at our ROM P90 that are definitely from our deploys that we weren't able to catch with those synthetic tests. So for us, this API would be useful because we would probably ignore those other traces that did have throttling applied to it in order to get that stable baseline with the ROM data.
Yeah, and to be clear, even just ignoring the throttled ones may not even be, it will make the data a bit more stable, but not necessarily like device distribution over time will still change, right? So it will, I feel like it's important to be able to do analysis of data in a given point in time for specific change you're looking in real user metrics, and this may help make the analysis a little simpler by excluding some cases you may not have control over, especially for use cases or users that don't receive a lot of data. And so if they receive some super wild throttling, it may skew their data too much. But it sounds like we're almost out of time. So it sounds like there is some interest, and then some people maybe not as interested.
I would like to add the interest from Salesforce, Nicola. I can go into details, but just I wanted to support the interest in such an API.
Can
Okay, cool.
I add one more use case? Was with the dev tools, there's definitely scenarios where we don't have a ton of ROM data, and we do need to separate out any traces that had throttling from DevTools being open. Like right now, my whole team is working on a new feature around video, and we're generating a lot of logs with DevTools open and with pretty slow performance, and we're seeing that it is affecting our run data. So it's difficult to try to hit our optimization goal, knowing that we're actually slowing our P90 down with our own work.
Yeah, I think DevTools is definitely one that I am supportive of as one that would make sense to be able to mark. I also think from a privacy perspective, that wouldn't necessarily be a big concern because I don't think general users would be affected by that. There's still a small risk there, but I think, yeah, being able to mark those. And I also think visibility is one that's significantly different from the others, because if you're loading a tab in the background, I would say you're most likely not waiting for it to load as much. I mean, I know that as a power user and as a geek, I do sometimes open a lot of tabs at once and do kind of eyeball the spinner in a way. So it's not entirely in the background in that sense. But I think that is still like a majority case where you likely want to be able to mark those things. But for the throttling, I personally think it could have a negative consequence on how developers improve user experiences.
I know we're kind of out of time, but if I may pitch in, I also agree with Timo that like exposing this could have some misuses, if I may. So at least if we can have a baseline of what throttling means, I mean, if it's like, let's say having a baseline. So yeah, because if we just say throttling and without specifying a baseline or something, we can have the let's say the opposite effect of people discarding data which would otherwise, let's say, prove to be actual real behavior, and they just discard them because they have the throttling flag on. So yeah, that's one concern of mine.
So thank you, everybody, for that discussion. Thanks, Nicholas, for leading it. We're definitely out of time. I want to respect everybody else's meeting schedules today. So we'll see everybody in about 2 weeks. If there's anything anybody wants to talk about next time, we can add it to the agenda. Otherwise, thank you.
Yeah, and for those that are joining the hackathon, see you on Tuesday.
Yes. Thanks for the reminder. See you soon. Bye.